and Market. At Front and Market stood a building called the London Coffee House. And the London Coffee House was designed for wealthy white businessmen to come, relax, chill out, and make business deals. And part of the business deals that they made was buying and selling black men, black women, and black children. Right down the street, right 4 blocks away is the London Coffee House. But before I go into more detail about the London Coffee House, let me talk about why we're here today. And we're here today because today is August 20, 2013, exactly 394 years ago from the beginning of slavery as we know it. And a side note, we in ATTAC is the organization that is organizing this event, ATAC, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. And we have people like Dr. Ed Robinson, an ancestor, Dr. Shirley Farham, an ancestor, and folks who are still with us, people like Dr. Molefe Asante, who give us the information we need in order to spread the word about our ancestors. So we know, technically, those black folks that were here in America in 1619, first of all, it really wasn't America, and the first black person on this land was not enslaved. We know that. So if you want to be technically precise, the people we're talking about are the first enslaved Africans in the British American colonies, or even more precise, the first enslaved Africans in English North America. But in order to avoid that complicated long-winded explanation, we're talking about the beginning of slavery in America as we know it. When did it begin? It began something like this. People like you and me, men, women, children, Africans, throughout Africa. Specifically, let's go to Southwest Africa. Let's go to Angola. Let's go to around 1617, 1618. And just like we're standing here right now, and I hope people can kind of be patient as I'm trying to explain this so you can feel exactly what I'm talking about. Imagine that we're not here in Philadelphia in 2013, but imagine we're in Africa, in Southwest Africa, and it's not 2013, it's 1619, and some village leader is talking to the people about what's going on. The news of the day, the business of the day, the interactions of the day. Men come and listen, women come and listen, boys and girls come and listen, and they talk to the village elder. And they go back and forth and do what we did in our societies before the European came. Now imagine this. Let's say it's 1619. Let's say it's the middle of August, 1619. And let's say we're in Southwest Africa. Specifically, we're in Angola. And as we're doing our thing and talking, we notice some different looking people begin to approach us. And we notice those different looking people have these weapons, these fire sticks. And from these weapons, from these fire sticks, they start to pull a contraption. We don't know what it is, but it's a trigger. And from this fire stick comes some type of projectile. And it begins to hit the men, and hit the women, and hit the boys, and hit the girls. And they start dying in front of your very eyes. And these people with these fire sticks begin to kill more people. And the ones they don't kill, they capture them. They put them in shackles. They put them in chains. And they lead them across what we now know as Angola to the western shore of the Atlantic. And when they get there, they see these floating dungeons. And they have no idea what these floating dungeons are because they're kept separate from each other and placed in what's known as factories. Factories has a different definition today, but back then, factories were these bamboo sticks. And these bamboo sticks were set up like a mini prison. And they would put our ancestors in these bamboo stick huts known as factories, and we would stay there for days and weeks while this floating dungeon waited. And more boys were brought in, more girls were brought in, more men were brought in, more women were brought in. And then when it's enough, they were all taken out, again in shackles, placed on this floating dungeon, never to be heard from again. But let me be more specific as to how it happened to our ancestors in Angola. The Portuguese basically started what we know as the international slave trade. Why? Because they had a powerful naval fleet. We are taught in school about Prince Henry the Navigator, but we don't talk about what Portugal did with those ships. They went around the world, they stopped in Africa, and if there's any criticism I have of our African ancestors, the criticism is the same one I have of our red brothers and sisters. They were too damn nice. They were embracing people who they saw as human beings. They welcomed these people in, and look what they got to show for it. What they should have done, I can't tell you in public, but I'll tell you privately what they should have done, and we wouldn't be standing here in America complaining about slavery. We'd be the most powerful continent on the planet as we were before the European came. But let me back up. So now, imagine before we get to the factories, the bamboo prisons, before we see the floating dungeons, we're doing our thing as black people, we're doing in Africa, minding our business. These foreigners come in and they grab us and they kill us and they take about 60 of us and they take us to these factories, these floating dungeons, and we're placed on slave ships. It's 60 of us at this time, and we're on the slave ship headed from Angola. Remember, this is the middle of August 1619 in Southwest Africa and Angola, now headed to Mexico, where we're going to be enslaved forever, and our children will be. But as this slave ship, a slave ship called the Sao Batista, is floating from Africa to Mexico, there's a English ship called the White Lion, which is a pirate ship. And there's another English ship called the Treasurer, which is also a pirate ship. These two English ships attack the Sao Batista and take everything from that ship, including the 60 Africans. 20 of those Africans are placed on the White Lion. 40 of those Africans are placed on the Treasurer. Fast forward to August 19, August 20, August 20, 1619. This ship arrives in what we now know as Hampton, Virginia. And these Africans are traded for stuff, for things, for sugar, for water, for food. Human beings are traded for products. These 20. About 4 days later, the other ship with the 40 on the Treasury. Remember, the 20 are in the White Lion. They arrive and they're sold. They're traded for items and products. A few days later, the Treasury arrives with the 40. But the people in what we now know today as Hampton, Virginia, the colonists, they wanted to buy these enslaved Africans for a cheap price. The pirates wanted a higher price. The deal could not be made. There was no sale, and these 40 were shipped off to Bermuda, and nobody knows what happened to them. But we know their hell began in Bermuda. But in regard to the 20, we know something about them. We know that of those 20, they all had names. They all had their own indigenous names. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a second, but history books don't tell you what their indigenous name is. History books tell us their names are Antonio and Isabella and Pedro. Those names are Spanish names. And for those who don't know, Spain is in Europe. When I talk about the European Spanish, I'm talking about people who are different from our Latino brothers and sisters today. I'm talking about people who are different from Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and other brown people. I'm talking about the Spaniards who even today consider themselves white, consider themselves European, in fact, even consider themselves Caucasian. So we know those 20 had names given to them by these Europeans, by these Christian Europeans. If you talk about some great religions on this planet, you always have to include Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, all great religions. But there are a lot of bad people who practice good religions. And some of these bad Christians had the audacity to baptize these 20 enslaved Africans. Now, how the hell are you going to baptize a human being but continue to enslave him? Because once they baptized these 20, they gave them Christian names like Antonio, like Isabella, like Pedro, So we know those names from the historical records. We also know that of those 20, two that I mentioned, Isabella and Antonio, fell in love. And from that relationship came a marriage. Not an official marriage as far as Virginia was concerned, but an official marriage between the two of them. And from them, they had a baby. And this baby was born 4 years after they were brought here. So that would be 1623. That baby is important because that African baby is the first African baby born in America that was officially recorded. That African baby's name is William Tucker. And William Tucker is a bad name for a couple reasons. The first is, it's a European name, and the baby should have had an African name. The second reason is, you might say, well, of all the names they could have selected, why William Tucker? Well, that name was forced on them and on their son by their quote-unquote master, Captain William Tucker, who bought the 20, including those two, Antonio and Isabella. So they were forced into naming their child after the man who enslaved them. That's where the name William Tucker comes from. But when we talk about that slavery that came out of what we now know today as Hampton, Virginia, that's not just limited to Virginia or limited to the South or even limited to the North. Specifically, it's right here in Pennsylvania. It's right here in Philadelphia, and that's why I started out talking about the London Coffee House, which is at Front and Market Street. And when you get a chance, you should stop down there. There's a marker, and I'm sure the marker is still there. About 2 weeks ago, the marker was taken down in order to be refurbished, and as of 3 or 4 days ago, it was not there, but it might be back there. Anyway, at the corner of Front and Market is where the London Coffee House stood, and there's a historical marker at that site. And in 1991, that historical marker was placed there. And that historical marker basically said, this is the site of the historic London Coffee House. At this site, businessmen engaged in trade and in the buying and selling of African human beings. That's what the historical marker in 1991 said. But let me tell you what the historical marker didn't say. The historical marker didn't say the horror and the hell and the damnation that these black men, women, and children went through. There were auctions there. And let me read to you exactly how the auctions went. And while I'm talking, those who want to should probably just close their eyes and just think about what happened when these black men, women, and children, Africans, were dropped off right there at the Delaware River, Front and Market Street. Back then, Market Street was called High Street. These Africans on the slave ship brought to the shore of the Delaware River right here in Philadelphia and then taken over to the London Coffee House. What happened then? This is what happened. And as I said, if you want to just close your eyes for a minute or two while you're listening to this, you're welcome to do that. This is how it went. The captured black men, women, and children, usually about 5 or 6 at a time, were placed on a thick wooden board, approximately 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, and set atop 2 heavy barrels on each end. These whipped and shackled human beings were paraded onto the boards, displayed by being forced to slowly turn around and bend over, and inspected by having their mouths pried open, their genitals grabbed, and their limb muscles flexed. And then they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Immediately afterward, the families were ripped apart, mother from daughter, father from son, brother from sister, husband from wife. Following these horrifically heart-wrenching separations, they were scattered across the country. The racist plan was for them to forget their families, but they didn't forget, and neither will we. They will never be forgotten, but will always be avenged. Can you imagine what took place here in Philly, just a few blocks from where we stand? And I had some more I wanted to share with you, but I'm going to get to why we're here and what I'd like to hear from you all. And before we do that, I mentioned that these 60 Africans who were taken out of Angola, and 40 on one slave ship and 20 on another slave ship that was brought here, we know some of their names. Their Christian names: Antonio, Isabella, and Pedro. But I don't like those names. I prefer names like Nzinga. And anybody who knows Nzinga, that was one of the greatest military leaders in world history. In fact, it was Queen Nzinga that kept the Portuguese at bay. There were some major military battles that took place between the people of Angola and the Portuguese and the Dutch. And in 1644, Queen Nzinga led a major victory in battle. 1647 led a major victory in battle. In fact, this sister, Queen Nzinga, fought and kept the Portuguese at bay until her mid-60s. Imagine your grandmother fighting some devils, and not only fighting devils, but winning. That's the history of Nzinga. So we don't really like Antonio. We don't really like Isabella. We don't really like Pedro as our indigenous names. We like Nzinga. We like Kulianji. We like Kangela. We like Mbandi. We like Nkumba. We like Kifuji and Kansa. Who are all these people? They're the mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers of Queen Nzinga. What I want to do at this point is, and if anybody here listens to my radio show, this past Sunday, I had a brother by the name of Calvin Pearson on my show. Calvin Pearson is the head of a group called Project 1619. They named it 1619. By the way, they're based in Hampton, Virginia, where the slave ship stopped. And they realized that 1619 was an important year. So they started this group called Project 1619. And they've been leading the battle to tell the story about what happened on August 20, 1619. And when I had him on the show, I asked him if he could either come today, but he couldn't because they're doing their great program in Virginia today. But he did agree to write a statement. And as the founder of this leading group, Project 1619, Calvin Pearson wrote the following words, very brief. August 20, 1619 represents the birth of Africa in America. The transatlantic slave trade was the biggest transgression of inhumanity toward another group of people. Our African ancestors were the only ethnic group brought to America in chains and against their will. They did not arrive as immigrants, but were sold like cattle on a trading block. The first Angolan Africans brought to English North America to Virginia were proud people, and their uncompensated labor built the greatest nation on earth. Our African ancestors endured 246 years of slavery, oppression, segregation, and denial of civil rights, waiting for freedom to arrive. We must never forget the sacrifices of our African ancestors and must always remember to stay strong in the face of opposition, and that righteousness will prevail. Having said that, and before I hear from you, at this point, I want to encourage people to come up here. And as we said in the flyer, we want people to use this opportunity as an oral catharsis. All that anger, all that rage, all that depression, all that frustration that's been building up in you since you found out about the horrors of American slavery. We're asking people to come up here unscripted and just spend a minute or 2 minutes talking about what the hell of slavery means to you. Say what you think your ancestors would have said. Say what you think your ancestors would have wanted you to say. And speaking of ancestors, before we hear the first person, we're going to ask people to begin to line up on this side, and then one at a time we'll just have people come up, spend a minute or two, say a few words, and then walk off to this side, then the second person, third person. But I want to say two quick things in terms of my venting and my frustration. Tomorrow is August 21, 2013. It'll be exactly 182 years ago from the very day when, on August 21, 1831, Nat Turner engaged in his rebellion. Nat Turner did his thing in Southampton County, Virginia, at age 31 on August 21, 1831. And people say, well, he didn't win. I say he did win. And he won because he lit the fire. He sparked the flame that led to freedom for people like you and me. So when I talk about what it means to me, the first name I think of is Nat Turner and what he did exactly 182 years ago from tomorrow when he struck a strong blow against slavery on August 21, 1831. And by the way, when people talk about Nat Turner, first of all, his name wasn't Nat Turner. The so-called owner was William Tucker. Nat had his own name, but history books can't seem to find it, but they know that he was a Christian minister. His first name was Nat, and he didn't accept the name Turner. We also know that he was a proud African. He would talk about how he comes from the Akan people of West Africa. He talked about how his grandmother was from the Coromantee tribe. And why is the Coromantee tribe important? By the way, his grandmother at age 13 was snatched up, kidnapped in West Africa, and brought to America. And through oral tradition, Nat Turner found out that his grandmother at age 13 was kidnapped and brought to America. He also knew that he was from, like she was, the Coromantee tribe. Why is the Coromantee tribe important? It's important because during the latter days or the latter decades of slavery, many southern states refused to accept Africans from the Coromantee tribe. Why? Because they were always rebelling, always resisting, always fighting. So if I'm an African, I want to be an African from the Coromantee tribe who is so powerful and so rebellious that even the American slave traders stopped buying them because they were too out of control. And the final thing I'll say before I turn it over to folks, we got folks lined up, and we encourage as many people as possible, just come up and vent your rage about the horror of slavery. Imagine that it wasn't 200 years ago in the South, but imagine it's today right now. Your loving mother, your loving father, sister, brother, son, daughter, foreigners come here right now and snatch them up and take their name, their religion, their culture, lynch them, castrate them, rape them. Horrible things. But that's what happened to your ancestors. And black people really haven't had a chance to vent. In fact, black people are the only people in the history of humankind that after they got from under the shackles, they agreed to work with the people that enslaved them. Every other group rebelled. The Palestinians are still fighting, as they should be. But black people, just like our ancestors, too damn nice. Having said that, let me say this. And I'm going to say a curse word only one time. And I'm only going to say it one time because, one, I'm that angry and that enraged, and I need to vent and to say it. But I'm not saying it just to be cursing gratuitously. I'm going to tell you what I mean by the curse word. If I was one of you and I was asked to come up and spend a minute talking about the horrors of slavery, and I was asked to say something, what would I say? I would say motherfucker. And people say, well, why would you say that? I would say that because that word, believe it or not, was created during slavery. That word did not exist before slavery. Black boys and black girls had to stand by, just like black husbands had to stand idly by while the slave master came into the slave cabin, grabbed up that beautiful chocolate African woman and raped her. These boys and girls, again, pardon my language, these boys and girls had to literally watch and hear their mothers get fucked. So because these Africans couldn't physically resist and physically fight back, they came up with a word to describe a horrible person. That word is the worst word that could be used to describe a person. So to be called an MF was to mean that you're the worst subhuman in the history of existence. That's my word, that's my venting, and I'm asking folks to come up one at a time and say your name and spend a minute or two explaining what the horrors of slavery means to you.